Before we get to comments, I just want to say that we shot this long before the US presidential election wrapped up, and so it is not acknowledged. But what I do want to acknowledge is how immeasurably proud I am of you guys, basically. Showing up to Idea Channel every week to talk about your ideas, talk about your opinions, talk about your politics, to find out how other people think, to find out how your thoughts compare to other people's thoughts. If not to meet in the middle, because you could argue endlessly about whether or not that's a fallacy of some kind, but to at least appraise yourself of some other side of some conversation, some concept, something. And I think it's beautiful, it's important, especially when it's civil, and I just want to say thank you. So, thank you. All right, on to the comments. In last week's episode, we talked about what literature is and how that relates to Bob Dylan. Let's see what you had to say. Hanging with DB Cooper starts us off with a really interesting dichotomy and talks about how they view literature as something which has as its charge a kind of like exploration, and that other pieces of writing which are made mostly for entertainment as opposed to exploration, a sort of, it's sort of like the deep and shallow dichotomy. Those things are not literature. And I think this is really interesting. And this is something that I end up talking a lot about with friends who ask, what makes something art? And so I give them always my spiel that if you've watched a lot of Idea Channel, you know exactly what it is. And when sort of confronted with the idea of like, okay, no, but like what, if we're not talking about experience, if we're not talking about people, is there something that is sort of endemic to the work that makes it art or not? And the thing that I always go to is, a piece of art is not going to try to come to its audience. It's going to ask its audience to walk towards it. And a piece of entertainment is going to meet its audience where it is, and it's going to require that its audience do the smallest amount of sort of psychological travel, let's say, in order to meet it on its own terms. And that is maybe one thing that you can say is the fundamental difference in the construction of art versus entertainment. That being said, I don't think, in my opinion, there is any one work that exists anywhere that is entirely trying to get people to come to it or entirely trying to get to people, and the way that distinction works is different from person to person. And so it is interesting to hear this applied to literature, to say that, literature is about exploration and maybe other kinds of stories are about entertainment. And then we just sort of have to puzzle through, like Hanging with DB Cooper says, the fineness of that line, which is, always an interesting discussion to have. Fine lines is where Idea Channel thrives. Mortles points out that Roman Jakobson's name is pronounced Jakobson and not Jacobson, which I apologize. I should have known better than to think that I knew how to pronounce someone's name, and also creates a really interesting distinction between something, between what they term literature and high literature, which is maybe more useful is maybe actually pretty useful. That what it does is it provides an idea that there is the kind of high literature, which is this thing that is put together to be literature, is likely to be regarded as literature, is sort of vaulted above other things as being worthwhile in that way, but that doesn't mean that there isn't this other sort of separate category of works that is also literary. It's just doesn't occupy the same space. Odelay, SalameeQueijos, and a bunch of other people said that the what is literature question seems to be just a rehash of the what is art conversation. And I think on one level this is true, that we're talking about, this is like a sort of, is it X and Y, define X, define Y, see where they meet. But on another level, I think that it is different, and I think a worthwhile conversation to have separately from what is art, because when you say art to someone, they will have a very clear idea of what art is, and when you say literature to someone, they will have a sort of, equally clear idea of what in their brains literature is. But those two things are not necessarily the same, and I think that they have different larger cultural values, that the value we give to art as conjured by that word and literature as conjured by that word is different. And so it is interesting and I think important to have a conversation about what they are as separate from one another. We can also get into the conversation of like, is every work of literature a work of art? Is every work of art a work of literature? And the sort of necessary distinctions that arise out of that. But yeah, I do think it is a related conversation, but I do not think it is the same, and I think it is important to have them as distinct conversations. Kelsomatic, this is a fair point. I think if I were to hand quote this sentence, this phrase, as appropriately as I possibly could, it would be, and to some extent, even YouTubers who can become real celebrities rather than just internet famous. So yeah, you can maybe understand why I didn't scare quote as much as I probably should have, but that's a very good point. Well taken. N.W. Vaughn points out that they don't find Bob Dylan's work to be appropriately titled literature for a couple of reasons, all of which I think are really interesting, but it seems like it boils down to a kind of epicness that they lack. And I think, you know, the response to this counterpoint, which I think is a really good one, is on the one hand, that is true of individual songs, but maybe it's not true of Bob Dylan's work as a whole, and that if we look at his entire output, that is itself maybe some kind of epic sort of story that he has put together, or at least epic text in some way. But then it's sort of half in response. Kahn Shawnery talks about Margaret Atwood's take on this that she delivered when she was being interviewed for Big Think, which is a really interesting video and podcast series if you don't listen to it. And Margaret Atwood put it really interestingly when asked, you know, whether or not he deserved it, whether or not it was something that makes sense. She said that she read it as a Swedish love letter to the United States at a time where, you know, the United States sort of needs to be shown some love. I think I wrote down her quote, so I want to read it. It's right now, at this moment of time, it's a little love letter sent by Sweden to America in America's time of need. And she then goes to sort of inhabit Sweden, asking America, what are you doing? In response to our political situation. And she also goes on to talk about the singer-songwriter as a figure of immense cultural importance in Sweden in a way that maybe we don't have as sort of readily here in the United States, and it's an encouragement maybe to appreciate our singer-songwriters that way. It also made me think about what other singer-songwriters are maybe our big sort of folk heroes. Bruce Springsteen? The one other thing that is worth noting is that Margaret Atwood in the Big Think interview never actually says that Bob Dylan's work is literary or that he deserves it, and actually in a preamble to an interview that she gave at The Guardian, it seems like she is maybe slightly aghast. The interviewer tells her that Bob Dylan has won the Nobel Prize, and apparently she says, "For what?" Which I find very funny, and you know, Margaret Atwood is a complicated lady, I guess. Litcrit points out that in Eagleton's newer work, he sort of overrides and in a certain sense expands the idea that calling things literature is an exercise of and sort of response to power, and mentions Eagleton's idea of literary reading as a kind of response to a demand that is put on the audience by a work, which is a really great point and a really good extension of this idea. I actually haven't read How to Read Literature, so you know, maybe in our upcoming break I'm gonna give that a look. This is a great comment. Check it out. Links to this one and all the others in the doobly-doo as well. Augusto Schmitt and a bunch of other people were surprised at the fact that every written thing is not in some way or to some degree considered literature. And this was really surprising to me and an unexpected result of this conversation. And I wonder the degree to which the effect of that response is linguistic in nature, as it is with Augusto talking about how, you know, that is the case in Portuguese. And Augusto makes a lot of really interesting and a lot of really great points about what it means to have perhaps wordless literature, like a comic that does not have speech or, other examples of things like that. And I'm really curious whether or not in the language that you speak, if you speak a language other than English, this distinction does seem strange, and how it sort of influences the importance of cultural works, and if that distinction exists. Like, is there a difference between fiction and literature, or is everything literature, and then is every written work then given the importance that we're sort of struggling with over here in English? So yeah, I'd be curious to know if you have any insight to this, how this works in other places. I hereby declare this comment response literature. Though, do I have to write it down first?